Rain hammered the stretched white canvas overhead with a steady rhythm that never seemed to slow down. The sound rolled across the massive tent in waves, mixing with the low murmur of defense contractors, city officials, military officers, and politicians balancing crystal glasses in their hands. The scent of wet pine drifted in every time someone entered through the heavy side flaps. A string quartet played somewhere near the far end of the gala, but most people barely noticed. I stood beside a large topographical display showing the Eastern Training Corridor and conservation buffer surrounding Fort Hawthorne. My dark greaserous uniform was pressed sharp enough to pass inspection. My hands rested loosely behind my back while I studied the map. Then a familiar voice cut through the evening. Not loud. Worse. "You are ruining your brother's chances, Valerie." I didn't turn immediately. The voice moved closer. "You're not welcome on this base tonight. Leave." Only then did I look at my father. Leland Ashford stood inches away from me. His jaw was locked tight. The muscles in his neck twitched every few seconds. Anyone watching from across the room would have assumed he was having a polite conversation with his daughter. They would have been wrong. My mother stood directly behind him, clutching the pearl necklace she wore to every important event. She stared somewhere over my shoulder, refusing to look me in the eye. I glanced downward. My father's polished black shoes were planted on a narrow section of land, highlighted on the map beneath the display glass. A very specific section. Then I took a slow breath. The kind I learned years ago while supervising bridge repairs after a hurricane had destroyed half a coastal supply route. Panic wastes energy. Silence gathers information. "Did you hear me?" my father whispered. "I heard you. Then leave." Several guests nearby continued chatting, completely unaware that my father was trying to throw me off a military installation where I worked. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so familiar. Across the tent, I spotted my brother Preston, entertaining a small circle of people near the sponsor exhibits. Entertaining might be too generous. Performing was probably more accurate. His expensive navy suit looked brand new. His watch flashed every time he moved his arm. He laughed too loudly at his own jokes. 3 defense contractors stood around him wearing polite smiles that looked increasingly painful. Preston loved an audience. Reality was optional. My father followed my gaze. "Your brother finally has an opportunity to rebuild what this family lost." I kept looking toward Preston. "He says that every year." My father's nostrils flared. "Because people keep getting in his way." That almost made me laugh. Almost. 3 years earlier, Preston had convinced everyone he was going to transform our family's historic property into an elite mountain resort. He hired consultants. He commissioned glossy architectural renderings. He hosted investor dinners that somehow always ended with someone else paying the bill. 16 months later, the project collapsed under nearly $18 million in debt. The bank took everything. Or at least that's what my family believed. A server carrying a tray of drinks passed between us. The interruption lasted maybe 3 seconds. My mother finally spoke. "Valerie, please." Her voice was soft, tired, careful. "Just let your brother have tonight." I looked at her. "Have what exactly?" Neither of them answered. Because answering honestly would require admitting something uncomfortable. Preston wasn't here because he had earned a seat at the table. He was here trying to convince people he belonged at one. A burst of laughter rose from his group again. One of the contractors glanced in my direction. His eyes briefly landed on the oak leaves displayed on my uniform. Then he looked back at Preston. The contrast was difficult to miss. My father stepped closer. "The commander doesn't need you hovering around these people." I raised an eyebrow. "Hovering? You know exactly what I mean." No. I knew exactly what he meant. He meant existing. My presence had become a problem, not because I had done anything. Because I represented something Preston could never control. Competence has a way of making insecure people uncomfortable, especially when it comes from the family member they've spent years dismissing. Rain crashed against the tent again. Harder this time. The sound filled the brief silence between us. I looked around the gala. Large screens displayed environmental preservation plans for the surrounding forest. Military engineers discussed infrastructure upgrades with state officials. Representatives from local communities reviewed transportation proposals pinned to presentation boards. Real work, real planning, real responsibility. Everything Preston hated. My father lowered his voice even further. "You've always been jealous of him." That one surprised me, not because it was true, Because after 36 years, he still genuinely believed it. I just studied his face. For a moment, I didn't see anger. I saw fear. Fear that the story he had told himself for years might not survive much longer. Fear that his favorite son wasn't the man he wanted him to be. Fear that the daughter he overlooked might force him to confront reality. The rain continued drumming overhead. Steady, patient, unimpressed. A few feet away, Preston suddenly snapped his fingers toward someone across the room. I watched several guests exchange uncomfortable looks. The evening was beginning to shift. The performance was starting to crack. And for the first time all night, I had a feeling my family wasn't prepared for what would happen once people stopped listening to promises and started paying attention to facts. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever worked your hardest, carried responsibilities nobody saw, and still been treated like the least important person in the room simply because someone else was better at selling an image? Let me know in the comments. And remember, our exclusive stories premiere every single day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Join us as part of your daily routine, and I'll see you at the next premiere. My gloved fingertips moved across the edge of the topographical map while the rain continued beating against the canvas above us. Most people saw colored contour lines, survey markers, and engineering overlays. I saw fence posts, creek crossings, old oak trees. I saw home. The eastern ridge on the display curved exactly where my grandfather used to ride horseback every Saturday morning. The southern meadow still appeared on modern survey maps as Parcel 14C, but nobody in my family had called it that for generations. To us, it had always been Miller's Field. At least it had been before Preston got involved. A burst of applause erupted somewhere behind me. One of the speakers had apparently announced a new community partnership initiative. I barely noticed. My attention stayed on the property lines. 500 acres. Every one of them familiar. Every one of them nearly gone. 3 years earlier, my phone rang while I was stationed overseas supporting a military infrastructure project. It was 2:18 in the morning local time. I had been reviewing bridge inspection reports when Preston called. That alone should have warned me. Preston never called unless he needed something. "You're going to love this," he said. Those were his exact words, "Love this." He then spent 42 minutes explaining a luxury mountain resort he was developing on family land, private villas, conference centers, high-end tourism, exclusive memberships. Words flowed out of him like water through a broken pipe. One problem: he wasn't using his money, he was using the land. I asked if Dad approved it. Preston laughed. That should have been warning number 2. By the time I returned home 8 months later, construction hadn't even started. The money was already gone. Consulting fees, marketing contracts, investor disputes, legal costs. A project manager who somehow received $387,412.66 before disappearing to Arizona. The numbers looked like a crime scene. The land had become collateral. The bank had become patient. Then the bank stopped being patient. I remember sitting inside a conference room downtown while attorneys reviewed foreclosure documents across a polished table. My father looked exhausted. My mother looked terrified. Preston looked offended. Not ashamed, not worried, offended. As though reality had personally insulted him. The foreclosure process moved quickly after that. 3 generations of family history vanished inside paperwork that took less than 40 minutes to sign. Nobody looked at me. Nobody asked what I thought. Nobody cared. According to my family, I was the daughter who escaped responsibility by joining the military. The daughter who spent her life working somewhere else. The daughter who wasn't important. Funny how those labels tend to stick until someone needs money. A contractor stepped beside the display table and pointed toward the Western Conservation Zone. "Beautiful property," he said to another guest. Property. The word lingered in my mind. After the foreclosure hearing, I spent 6 straight weeks reviewing financial records every evening after work. I studied environmental restrictions, zoning regulations, development proposals, tax obligations. I learned something my family never bothered learning. The land wasn't dead, it was simply drowning under debt. Big difference. Most buyers stayed away because the liability scared them. Environmental protections limited development. Infrastructure repairs were expensive. The access roads needed upgrades. The creek restoration alone carried an estimated cost of $1.4 million. Investors saw problems. I saw possibilities. 3 months later, I liquidated nearly everything. Savings accounts, investment funds, deployment bonuses, years of accumulated military pay. I even sold a restored 1969 Mustangs I'd spent years rebuilding. That hurt more than some deployments. The final transfer left my checking account looking almost empty. My financial advisor thought I had lost my mind. Maybe I had. But some things are worth more than numbers. The purchase happened through a blind trust. Quiet, legal, invisible. Exactly how I wanted it. No press releases, no family meetings, no victory lap. The transaction closed 4:37 p.m. on a Thursday. By 5:12 p.m., I officially owned the land. Nobody in my family knew. Nobody knows how difficult it is to keep a secret until that secret costs you everything. The military approached less than a year later. They wanted to expand environmental protection around the base perimeter. The proposal made perfect sense. The conservation buffer would preserve the forest, protect local wildlife, and prevent commercial development from creeping toward training operations. The annual lease offer arrived in a neat federal packet. I still remember staring at the number. I crossed it out. Then I wrote another one, $1 per year. My attorney thought I had made a typo. I hadn't. The land wasn't supposed to make me rich. It was supposed to survive. Rain rattled the tent again, steady, persistent. Across the room, Preston continued talking with contractors. His arms moved dramatically while he spoke. His smile looked larger than before. He always became louder when he felt insecure. My father believed Preston represented the future of the Ashford name. My mother believed protecting Preston somehow protected the family. Neither of them understood what had actually happened. In their version of events, the government eventually absorbed the property. The story was cleaner that way. Nobody had to discuss Preston's mistakes. Nobody had to discuss consequences. And certainly nobody had to admit that the daughter they treated like a background character had quietly saved everything. I slid my hand along the edge of the eastern ridge shown on the map. The exact property boundary ran beneath the display, beneath the concrete foundation, beneath the entire annex. Most people inside this tent had no idea. That was fine with me. Recognition had never been the goal. Protection was. Across the room, I noticed one of Preston's contractors checking his watch while Preston continued talking. Another guest looked toward the exit. A third was already losing interest. The audience was shrinking. Preston just hadn't noticed yet. And judging from the confidence on his face, he still believed tonight was going exactly according to plan. One of the contractors quietly adjusted his stance and took half a step backward while Preston continued talking. That tiny movement told me more than anything coming out of my brother's mouth. People leaned in when they were interested. They leaned away when they were looking for an exit. Preston never noticed the difference. The rain drummed steadily above us while he launched into another story, waving a whiskey glass he had barely touched. "You have to understand," he said, smiling broadly. "My family's been connected to this region for generations." The contractors nodded politely. Professional politeness. Nothing more. Preston mistook it for admiration. A dangerous habit. "I practically grew up on this terrain," he continued. "Nobody knows these hills better than I do." One contractor glanced toward the topographical display behind me. Another looked down at the brochure in his hand. Neither looked impressed. Preston kept going anyway. "I still have influence around here. Historical influence. Historical influence." That was a new one. Apparently bankruptcy had upgraded itself into expertise. I remained beside the map, hands resting behind my back. Years in the military teach you something valuable. You don't have to attend every argument you're invited to, especially when reality is already doing the work for you. The group included representatives from 3 separate defense logistics firms. I recognized several names from procurement briefings. One man wore a badge identifying him as a regional operations director. Another specialized in transportation infrastructure. The third appeared to be an engineer. Not easy people to fool. Unfortunately for Preston, confidence impresses amateurs. Experts usually ask questions. His smile widened. Our family originally controlled over 500 acres surrounding this entire area. That part was technically true. Truth often makes the best disguise. He just conveniently skipped everything that happened afterward. The military knows our history here. Another half-truth. Those are even more dangerous. The operations director finally spoke. "Interesting." Preston brightened immediately. A fisherman who felt a tug on the line. "We've been discussing potential logistics partnerships," Preston said. I believe my local knowledge could be extremely valuable. The engineer raised an eyebrow. What kind of logistics experience do you have? A simple question, an honest question, the kind Preston hated. He recovered quickly. Development projects, land management, regional planning. I almost laughed. 3 years ago, he hired a survey company and then forgot to pay them. The bill sat in collections for 11 months, regional planning. Sure, the rain rattled harder against the canvas. Nearby guests continued circulating between exhibits and sponsor displays. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of appetizers. A large digital screen rotated through environmental conservation statistics. Everything around Preston was real. That was his biggest problem. Reality creates comparison. The operations director looked unconvinced. So you've worked directly with federal transportation requirements? Preston hesitated, barely, but I saw it. Then he smiled again, not directly, but I've worked alongside people who have. Translation? No, the contractor nodded politely. Translation, I noticed. An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Preston hated silence even more than questions. He immediately searched for something to regain control. His eyes moved across the room. Then they landed on me. I knew that look. Every family has roles. My role had always been useful background furniture, reliable, quiet, convenient. His expression brightened. There it is, the prop, the solution, the little sister. Preston snapped his fingers, actually snapped his fingers, at me, like I was standing beside a restaurant table holding a notepad. Several nearby conversations paused. Not completely, just enough. Valerie! His voice carried farther than he intended. I slowly turned my head. The contractor followed his gaze. My little sister works here. I saw one contractor glance at the rank insignia on my uniform, then at Preston, then back to me. The comparison wasn't helping him. Preston either didn't notice or didn't care. Probably both. He flashed the group his biggest salesman smile, the one he used whenever he was trying to sell confidence he didn't actually possess. Valerie, be a good girl and fetch us some dry towels, will you? Silence, not loud silence. The worst kind. The kind that arrives when people aren't sure they heard something correctly. One contractor blinked, another shifted his weight. The engineer looked down into his drink. Nobody laughed, nobody smiled, nobody joined in. The rain continued overhead. Steady, patient. My hands remained behind my back in parade rest. I didn't move. I didn't react. I didn't rescue him from what he had just done. That's the funny thing about arrogance. Given enough time, it introduces itself. Preston's smile flickered, just for a second. He expected compliance. Or an argument. Anything that restored his position as the important person in the conversation. Instead, he got nothing. People often underestimate the power of stillness. Especially loud people. My father noticed the exchange from across the room. I could see him watching. My mother, too. Neither intervened. That wasn't surprising. Growing up, silence had always been their preferred response whenever Preston crossed a line. Correction might hurt his feelings. Apparently, my dignity was more expendable. The operations director cleared his throat. His eyes never left my uniform. You're military? The question wasn't directed at Preston. It was directed at me. For the first time all evening, Preston looked genuinely nervous. Just a flash, gone almost immediately. But it was there, because deep down, he understood something. He had spent years building importance through stories. I had spent years building credibility through work. Stories require maintenance, competence doesn't. Before I could answer, Preston jumped back into the conversation. Oh, Valerie handles administrative stuff. Administrative stuff. Interesting description. I made a mental note of it. The engineer studied me again. His expression suggested he didn't believe a word of that explanation. Neither did the others. The distance between perception and reality was beginning to narrow. And once that process starts, it becomes very difficult to stop. Preston kept talking, faster now, louder. Trying to reclaim ground he could feel slipping beneath his feet. The contractors listened, but not the way they had earlier. Their attention had changed. Their curiosity had changed. And for the first time all night, they weren't looking at my brother when they asked questions. They were looking at me. The operations director kept his attention on me while Preston rushed to fill the silence. That alone told me everything. The contractors weren't listening to him anymore. They were evaluating him. Big difference. The engineer held his drink against his chest and nodded toward the topographical display behind me. Since we're talking about logistics, he said, I'm curious about something. Preston immediately brightened, finally. A question he thought he could answer. The engineer pointed directly at the eastern ridge shown on the map. If heavy transport vehicles were routed through this corridor during prolonged rainfall, how stable is the subgrade? The smile on Preston's face never moved. The confidence never changed. Unfortunately, neither did his ignorance. "Oh, that's one of the strongest sections of terrain in the region," he said immediately. Too quickly. Experienced professionals recognize that speed. People who actually know complex answers usually take a moment to think. People making things up answer right away. Preston continued. "The ridge is mostly rock, very little movement. You could run heavy equipment through there year-round." The engineer's expression remained neutral. The operations director stopped sipping his drink. The third contractor quietly folded his arms. Nobody interrupted. Preston took that as encouragement, a common mistake. "Honestly," he said, "if I were planning transport routes, I'd probably prioritize that entire eastern section." I stared at him. Not because he was wrong. Because he was catastrophically wrong. There was a difference. The eastern ridge looked stable from a distance. Most people assumed it was. The surface gave that impression. Unfortunately, engineering decisions aren't made from impressions. They're made from data. A lot of data. The engineer tilted his head slightly. Interesting. That one word carried enough skepticism to fill the entire tent. Preston missed it. Again. "The underlying composition is excellent," Preston added. "Minimal concerns." Minimal concerns. I almost admired the confidence. Almost. The problem was that several $1 million worth of infrastructure could fail if someone actually followed his advice. The operations director looked toward me. Then back to the map. Then back to me again. He already knew something wasn't adding up. The rain intensified overhead. The sound echoed through the tent in steady waves. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the engineer asked a follow-up question. "What saturation percentage would trigger load restrictions?" Preston blinked just once. There it was, the first crack. He recovered quickly. Too quickly. Not enough to matter. The engineer slowly lowered his glass. The operations director exchanged a glance with the third contractor. Preston had officially entered dangerous territory. Because now he wasn't merely exaggerating. He was inventing technical information. I finally stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not aggressively. Just one step. The movement immediately shifted the group's attention. "Actually," I said calmly, "the eastern ridge is one of the most closely monitored sections on the entire property." Silence. Preston's smile froze. The engineer looked interested. Very interested, I continued. "The surface appears stable because of the bedrock formation beneath the western face. But the upper transport corridor sits over mixed soil layers with significant seasonal saturation variation." Nobody interrupted. Good sign. Professionals listen when information becomes useful. The last geotechnical survey showed moisture retention levels increasing by nearly 21% after extended rainfall periods. The engineer's eyebrows rose. The operations director stopped looking at Preston entirely. "If heavy vehicle traffic exceeded projected load limits during those conditions," I continued, "you could experience progressive subsurface displacement along sections of the ridge." The third contractor immediately nodded. He understood exactly what I meant. Preston clearly didn't. I pointed toward the map. "The military engineering review requires transport restrictions once saturation levels approach threshold values established under federal infrastructure guidance." The engineer smiled slightly, not because I was impressive, because the answer was correct. "There's a difference." "Which guidance?" he asked. I answered without hesitation. Unified Facilities, Criteria 3-220-01, and Associated Load-Bearing Standards for Military Transportation Routes. The engineer's smile widened. The operations director looked genuinely relieved, as if someone had finally turned the lights on. Meanwhile, Preston looked like a man watching his lottery ticket catch fire. I wasn't attacking him. That was the part he couldn't understand. I wasn't trying to embarrass him. The facts were doing that all by themselves. The engineer stepped closer to the display. "What's the current saturation estimate after this week's rainfall?" I gave him the number, not a rounded number, the real number, 38.7% based on the latest assessment. His reaction was immediate. "So routing heavy transport there right now would be a mistake, correct?" The operations director nodded. "An expensive mistake." "Very." The contractor folded his arms. "Potentially catastrophic." Also correct, nobody looked at Preston. Not one person. That might have been the most painful part. A few minutes earlier, he had been the center of attention. Now he wasn't even part of the conversation. The physical shift was subtle, but impossible to miss. The contractors gradually rotated toward me, shoulders, feet, eye contact, all of it. Human beings reveal their priorities long before they realize they're doing it. The group now formed a loose semicircle around the map, around me. Preston remained standing on the outside. The engineer extended his hand. Major Ashford, right? I shook it. Valerie Ashford. Excellent analysis, just accurate analysis. His grin broadened. The operations director laughed quietly. I liked that answer. Across the room, I noticed my father watching. His expressions darkened considerably. My mother looked worried. Not for me. For Preston. Always Preston. My brother's face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion. Disbelief. Embarrassment. Then anger. A deep, burning anger that comes from being exposed without anyone actually attacking you. Because insults can be dismissed. Facts cannot. The rain continued pounding against the canvas overhead. Steady. Relentless. And, for the first time all evening, Preston was beginning to realize something dangerous. The people he came here to impress were no longer interested in his stories. They were interested in the person he had spent years pretending wasn't important. The contractors lingered around the map for another minute before gradually dispersing toward other exhibits across the gala. Not one of them asked Preston for a business card. That detail did not escape him. I watched him force a smile as they left. He shook hands. He nodded. He pretended everything was fine. The second the last contractor turned away, the smile vanished completely. His face tightened, his jaw flexed. His eyes immediately searched the room until they landed on our parents. Then he marched toward them. Fast. Too fast for someone who claimed everything was under control. I didn't need to hear every word. The expression said enough. Preston was furious, not because he had been wrong, because someone else had been right. There are people who learn from embarrassment. Preston always treated it like an enemy attack. My father listened while Preston spoke rapidly into his ear. Every few seconds, Preston pointed in my direction. My mother's shoulders sank lower with each sentence. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered how many times she had watched things happen without saying a word. The rain pounded harder against the tent. A low roll of thunder echoed somewhere in the distance. Several guests glanced toward the canvas ceiling before returning to their conversations. Nobody else realized a different storm was forming 20 yards away. My father suddenly turned and started walking toward me. His pace wasn't hurried, it was determined. The kind of walk people use when they've already decided they're right. My mother followed a few steps behind. I remained exactly where I was, hands behind my back, posture straight, breathing steady. The closer he got, the more I noticed the tremor in his right hand, not fear. Strain. The strain of trying to hold together a story that was falling apart. He stopped directly in front of me. Too close. Close enough that nobody else could hear us, unless they were actively trying. His finger rose toward my chest, shaking. You have always been jealous of him. The words came out as a harsh whisper, the kind that carried more anger than shouting ever could. I looked at him quietly. He continued. You couldn't stand seeing him succeed. I almost asked which success he meant. The resort bankruptcy? The foreclosure? The endless stream of failed projects? But there was no point. This wasn't a conversation. It was a defense mechanism. My father wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to the version of me he had invented years ago. The version that made his choices easier to justify. This was our land, he hissed. His voice cracked slightly. The first sign of weakness, his legacy. There it was. Not ours, not the family's, his. Everything always came back to Preston. The favored son, the future of the Ashford name, the man who had nearly destroyed it. My father pointed toward the floor beneath us. You are a disgrace to this family. Rain hammered the canvas overhead. Nobody nearby seemed to notice. The rest of the gala continued moving around us. Servers carried trays through the crowd. Military officers discussed infrastructure projects. Community leaders reviewed proposal boards. Life kept moving. Meanwhile, my father stood on land he thought belonged to someone else and demanded that I leave it. The irony was almost painful. Get off this property right now. The words hung between us, heavy, final, certain. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then my mother finally stepped forward. I looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time all evening, she met my eyes. I wish she hadn't. Because what I saw hurt more than my father's anger. Fear. Not fear for me. Fear for Preston. Always Preston. She clasped her hands together. Please, Valerie. Her voice sounded soft, almost gentle. That made it worse. Just go. I waited. Part of me hoped there would be more. An explanation. A defense. A sign that she saw what was happening. Instead, she added 4 words. Don't take this away from your brother. I stared at her. The sentence landed harder than anything my father had said, not because it was cruel, because she genuinely believed it. In her mind, I was the problem. Not the lies, not the failures, not the humiliation Preston created for himself. Me, the daughter standing quietly at a military event, the daughter who had spent years fixing problems she never created. The daughter being asked to disappear once again. A strange calm settled over me, not the calm I used during military inspections, not the calm that comes before difficult decisions, something different, something older. I looked at both of them, the people who had raised me, the people who were supposed to protect me when I was a child, the people who taught me right from wrong, or at least claimed they had. And in that moment, I understood something I should have understood years earlier. They weren't defending Preston because he was right. They were defending him because the truth had become explosive. Admitting reality would require admitting their mistakes. Admitting reality would force them to see who had actually protected the family. And they weren't ready for that. Maybe they never would be. The realization didn't make me angry. That surprised me. I thought it would. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness. Not for myself, for them, because they had spent so many years investing everything in an illusion that they could no longer recognize the person standing directly in front of them. My father mistook my silence for surrender. I could see it happen. His shoulders relaxed slightly. His expression softened just enough to suggest he thought he had won. He thought I was about to leave. My mother seemed to think the same thing. Then both of them noticed something beyond my shoulder. Their expressions changed instantly. Confusion first, then uncertainty, then concern. I didn't turn around immediately, but I heard it. Heavy footsteps approaching across the temporary flooring, measured. Deliberate. The kind of footsteps that make people move aside without being asked. And judging by the sudden silence spreading through the nearby crowd, whoever was walking toward us carried far more authority than anyone in my family had planned for. The sound of those footsteps grew louder with every second. Heavy, measured, unhurried. The kind of walk that didn't need attention because attention arrived on its own. Conversations near the entrance began fading one by one. A few guests turned their heads. Others instinctively stepped aside. Even the waitstaff adjusted their paths without being told. I still hadn't turned around. I didn't need to. I recognized that pace. The tent flaps opened. A gust of cool air swept inside, carrying the scent of rain-soaked pine and wet earth. The chatter dropped another level, then another, then almost disappeared completely. My father lowered his hand. My mother took a small step backward. Neither of them understood what was happening. Preston did. At least he thought he did. His expression changed immediately. The anger vanished. The humiliation vanished. The salesman returned. A wide smile spread across his face as he straightened his jacket and adjusted his tie. Opportunity had just walked into the room, or so he believed. I finally turned. Base Commander Nathan Cross had entered the gala, accompanied by the installation's senior legal counsel, Rebecca Langley. Cross wasn't physically imposing because of his size. He was imposing because of his presence. People trusted him. People respected him. Most importantly, people knew he didn't care about status games. His reputation around Fort Hawthorne was simple. Bring him facts. Leave the nonsense at home. The commander moved through the crowd with calm purpose. Not looking left, not looking right, just walking. His boots struck the temporary flooring with a steady rhythm that somehow seemed louder than the rain overhead. Thud, thud. Every step carried authority, and every step brought him closer. Preston practically launched himself into the commander's path. The timing was almost impressive, like a man diving in front of a train because he believed it was coming to pick him up. Commander Cross! His voice rang out across the suddenly quiet space. Several guests stopped moving altogether. Preston extended his hand. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect confidence, Preston Ashford. Cross didn't slow down, didn't reach for the hand, didn't acknowledge the introduction. Preston's smile remained frozen, a dangerous sign. People smile naturally. Frozen smiles belong to people realizing something is wrong. We were just discussing the future of this land, Preston continued quickly. Cross kept walking. The outstretched hand remained hanging in empty air. For one awkward second, then two, then three. Nobody rescued him, not a single person. The legal counsel walked past him as well, completely. As if he were standing next to them, rather than directly in front of them. The smile finally began to crack. I almost felt bad for him, almost. Cross stepped around Preston the same way someone might step around a folding chair left in the wrong place. No hostility, no disrespect. Just complete irrelevance that was somehow worse. The commander continued forward. Straight toward me, the crowd noticed. You could actually see the realization spreading. One person turned, then another, then another. Tiny reactions creating a chain across the room. People started following his line of travel with their eyes. And every one of those eyes eventually landed on me. The silence deepened. My father looked confused, genuinely confused. His attention bounced between me and the approaching commander. Tiny sense of something that refused to fit inside the story he had built. My mother looked worried. The kind of worried that appears when events stop following expectations. Meanwhile, Preston remained standing near the center aisle, alone, his hands slowly lowered back to his side. The expression on his face suggested he was replaying the last 10 seconds in real time, searching for a different outcome. Unfortunately for him, reality doesn't offer revisions. Cross continued walking. The legal counsel remained half a step behind him. Neither appeared rushed. Neither appeared uncertain. This wasn't a spontaneous interaction. That much was obvious. The operations director from earlier noticed it too. I saw him exchange a glance with the engineer. Both men suddenly looked very interested. Across the tent, several military officers subtly straightened their posture. Years of service create certain habits. Respect becomes automatic. The rain hammered against the canvas again, hard. The sound rolled through the structure like distant artillery, then everything quieted. For a brief moment, the entire gala seemed suspended. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even Preston had finally stopped talking. Cross stopped directly in front of me, close enough for a normal conversation, far enough to remain formal. The legal counsel halted beside him. I noticed the thick federal document folder tucked beneath her arm. Interesting, very interesting. My father's eyes widened slightly. I don't think he had ever seen a base commander deliberately seek me, not once. To him, I was still the daughter who had disappeared into military service years ago. The daughter doing administrative work somewhere behind a desk. The daughter who was supposed to stay invisible. The commander looked at me. His expression remained completely professional. No smile, no performance, just business. The kind of professionalism that carries its own weight. Around us, dozens of people waited. Contractors, officials, military officers, community leaders, my family. Every one of them sensed something important was about to happen. Nobody knew exactly what. Not yet. The anticipation itself became its own force. I could practically feel it. My father swallowed hard. My mother clasped her hands together. Preston took a cautious step forward, as if trying to reinsert himself into whatever conversation was about to occur. The legal counsel noticed. Her expression immediately discouraged the idea. He stopped. Smart decision. The rain continued striking the canvas overhead. Steady, persistent, almost patient. Commander Cross finally opened his mouth to speak, and judging by the sudden tension that swept through the room, everyone understood that whatever came next was going to change the entire evening. The legal folder beneath Rebecca Langley's arm suddenly seemed a lot heavier than it had a few seconds earlier. Nobody in the tent moved. Nobody wanted to. The rain continued pounding the canvas overhead while Commander Cross stood directly in front of me. Then, without hesitation, he snapped into a sharp, textbook salute. Every military officer in the room recognized it immediately. Several civilians didn't understand what they were seeing. My family certainly didn't. I returned the salute automatically. Years of training removed the need for thought. For one brief second, the entire room seemed frozen. I heard someone quietly set down a glass. I heard fabric rustle somewhere behind me. I heard Preston inhale sharply. Then Commander Cross lowered his hand. Major Ashford. His voice carried clearly across the tent. Not loud. Just impossible to ignore. The Pentagon approved the 99-year conservation lease. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Conservation lease? Pentagon? People began exchanging glances. Cross continued. We just need the property owner's final signature. Silence. Not awkward silence. Not social silence. The kind that appears when an entire room realizes it is missing a critical piece of information. My father's forehead creased. I watched him process the sentence, then reject it, immediately. Owner? The word escaped before he could stop it. He stepped forward. The bank owns this land. Several guests turned toward him. Cross looked at my father for the first time all evening, and the temperature in his expression seemed to drip 10 degrees. No anger, no hostility, just absolute certainty. No, Mr. Ashford. My father blinked. Cross continued. The bank was preparing to sell the property to an industrial chemical processing company. A murmur spread through the nearby crowd. I wasn't surprised. The proposal had never become public knowledge. The company planned to clear large sections of protected woodland and build storage facilities near watershed areas. The environmental impact studies alone had triggered multiple objections. Cross didn't pause. Major Ashford purchased the property 3 years ago. The murmurs stopped. Instantly, every person in the room suddenly became very interested. My father stared at him, my mother stared at him. Preston stared at him. None of them seemed capable of speaking. Cross delivered the final piece with the same calm professionalism. She purchased it to preserve your family's legacy and prevent commercial development. The words landed harder than any accusation could have, because they were true. No embellishment, no exaggeration, just truth. And truth has a habit of arriving all at once. My father looked at me, then at Cross, then back at me. The confusion on his face was almost painful to watch. His mind was trying to fit reality into a framework that no longer worked. The daughter he considered a failure. The daughter he tried to remove from the gala. The daughter standing quietly beside the map. Nothing matched the story he had spent years believing. Beside him, my mother slowly covered her mouth with one hand. Her eyes widened. Not dramatically, just enough. Like someone discovering a door had been unlocked the entire time. Across the room, Preston looked pale. Very pale. The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost visible. For years he had survived on one's assumption that nobody else knew what he had lost. That assumption had just died. The legal counsel stepped forward and carefully opened the federal document folder. Several pages appeared: lease agreements, approval documents, signature pages, official seals. The kind of paperwork that leaves no room for argument. Commander Cross nodded toward me. No ceremony, no performance, just business. I reached toward my uniform, slowly, calmly. The room watched, every eye followed the movement. I unbuttoned the left breast pocket of my service coat. My father frowned. He didn't understand, not yet. Neither did Preston, neither did my mother. From inside the pocket, I removed a folded document protected by a transparent archival sleeve. Old paper, original paper. The paper, I had carried it for years. Not because I planned this moment, because ownership carries responsibility. I unfolded it carefully and placed it on the display table beside the topographical map. Nobody spoke. The document rested beneath the overhead lighting. Simple, ordinary, devastating. There was my name, Valerie Ann Ashford, the sole owner, no partnerships, no trusts listed, no family co-signers, no corporate entities, just me. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The contractors from earlier stepped closer, not rudely, just enough to confirm what they were seeing. The operations director looked down, then slowly exhaled. The engineer shook his head once, not disbelief, respect. The legal counsels quietly turned the document so everyone could read it more clearly. That wasn't necessary. The damage had already been done, or maybe the truth had already been done. Depends how you look at it. My father stared at the deed. His eyes moved across the page, then returned to my name, then returned again, as though repeated reading might somehow change the outcome. It didn't. He took a small step backward, then another. The movement looked involuntary, like his body understood something before his mind could accept it. For the first time all evening, he had no response, no accusation, no lecture, no explanation, nothing. Because every argument he had prepared depended on one assumption, that I had no claim. That assumption was now sitting on the table in black ink. Across from him, Preston looked physically sick. Not embarrassed, not frustrated, sick. His shoulders slumped. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Whatever speech he had prepared disappeared, gone. The future he had been selling all evening suddenly looked very different when standing next to documented ownership. I looked at all three of them, my father, my mother, my brother. The strange thing was that I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. The moment was too serious for any of that. Because this wasn't revenge. Not really. Revenge would have been letting the land disappear. Revenge would have been standing back and watching the consequences unfold. Instead, I had spent years protecting something that belonged to people who never appreciated it. The rain continued beating against the canvas overhead, steady, unchanged, as if the storm itself couldn't care less who finally owned the ground beneath our feet. And standing there beside the deed, I realized the hardest part wasn't revealing the truth. The hardest part was watching the people I loved finally understand who had been carrying their legacy all along. The rain continued falling against the canvas overhead, but nobody seemed to hear it anymore. The deed remained on the display table. My name remained on the deed. And the truth sat in the middle of the gala like an anchor nobody could move. No one argued. That was the surprising part. For years, my family could turn almost anything into an argument. Money, responsibility, success, failure, reality itself. But some truths are too heavy to fight. This was one of them. Commander Cross stood quietly beside the table while the legal counsel organized the lease documents. The contractors had stopped pretending to browse exhibits. Most of them remained nearby, watching the scene unfold with professional curiosity. Not gossip, respect. The difference mattered. Across from me, my mother still had one hand covering her mouth. The tears in her eyes weren't dramatic, they weren't performative. For the first time all evening, they looked real. I watched her stare at the deed, then at me, then back at the deed, over and over, as if she were trying to reconcile two versions of her daughter, the version she had carried in her head for years, and the woman standing in front of her. Eventually her shoulders sagged. Not from age, not from exhaustion, from realization. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive like a lightning strike. Sometimes it arrives like gravity, slowly, then all at once. My father looked older than he had an hour earlier. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. Even the anger had disappeared. All that remained was a man standing in the ruins of assumptions he had spent years protecting. He looked down at the deed one more time, then finally looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in a long while. Valerie, his voice cracked. The sound startled him as much as it startled me. He cleared his throat and tried again. We didn't know. A long silence followed. The rain filled it. We didn't know, he repeated quietly. There are moments when people realize they've been wrong. Then there are moments when people realize how long they've been wrong. The second kind hurts more. My father took a hesitant step forward, his hand lifted slightly, not commanding, not accusing, just reaching. The same hand that had pointed at my chest earlier, the same hand that told me to leave. Now it looked uncertain, almost fragile. Valerie, you saved our home. I could hear the regret. I could hear the shame. But I could also hear something else. The belief that if he found the right words, everything might return to normal. As if the last 3 years could somehow be erased. As if this revelation fixed everything that came before it. Life doesn't work that way, neither does trust. Before his hand reached my arm, I stepped gently to the side. Not dramatically, not angrily, just enough. The distance wasn't physical. It was something deeper. His hand slowly lowered. Nobody spoke. The room waited. I looked at him, then at my mother, then briefly at Preston. My brother hadn't moved. He stood near the edge of the gathering with his shoulders slumped and his eyes fixed on the floor. For once he had nothing to sell, no story, no pitch, no explanation, just consequences. Then I looked back at my father. I didn't save it for you, Dad. My voice remained calm, soft enough to stay personal, clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. His expression tightened, not from anger, from understanding. I continued. I didn't save it for Preston. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. I didn't save it because I wanted recognition. The rain tapped steadily against the tent, almost gentle now. I saved it because true legacy is about what you protect, not what you pretend to own. The words settled over the crowd, simple, nothing dramatic, nothing rehearsed, just truth. Commander Cross glanced toward me briefly. Not approval, recognition. The kind professionals give each other when something important has been said. My mother lowered her eyes. Tears finally escaped. My father nodded once, slowly. There was nothing he could argue with, because deep down he knew exactly what I meant. For years, everyone in the family had talked about legacy. Preston talked about it when he needed investors. My father talked about it when he wanted obedience. My mother talked about it whenever appearances mattered. But protecting something is different from talking about it. Responsibility is different from ownership, and sacrifice is different from entitlement. The legal counsel slid the lease documents across the display table. The signature page rested on top. 99 years. Environmental preservation. Protected buffer zone. A future that couldn't be sold off by someone's bad decision. I removed a black pen from my uniform pocket. The same pen I carried during inspections and project reviews. Nothing expensive, nothing special, just reliable. The way important things usually are. I signed my name, Valerie Ann Ashford. The ink dried almost immediately. I handed the documents back to Commander Cross. He reviewed the signature. Satisfied, he closed the folder. "Thank you, Major." I nodded. "Thank you, sir." That was it. No celebration. No applause. No victory speech. The work was finished. The crowd slowly began moving again. Conversations cautiously restarted. People exhaled. The evening resumed. But something fundamental had changed. I looked at my family one last time. My mother appeared heartbroken. My father appeared lost. Preston looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not physically, just human. For years, I thought I wanted them to understand. Standing there, I realized understanding wasn't something I could force. People arrive at truth when they're ready, or they don't. Either way, my responsibility ended there. I turned toward the exit. The tent flaps opened. Cool air rushed inside. The scent of wet pine filled my lungs. Then I stepped out into the rain. The water soaked my uniform almost immediately. I didn't care. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to carry. Behind me stood a family, finally realizing that the daughter they tried to remove from the base had been the one protecting the ground beneath their feet all along. Ahead of me stretched the property I had spent years preserving. 500 acres, protected, secure, still standing. I kept walking, and this time I didn't look back. The rain followed me for almost half a mile after I left the gala. Not a storm. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. Just a steady northwest rain doing what it had always done. I eventually stopped near the edge of the conservation area and looked across the dark tree line stretching toward the eastern ridge. For the first time in years, nobody was demanding anything from me. Nobody was asking me to fix a problem. Nobody was asking me to make a sacrifice. Nobody was telling me who I was supposed to be. And that felt strange. I think a lot of people watching this story probably expect me to say that revealing the deed was the best moment of my life. It wasn't. The best moment came afterward. The moment I realized I no longer needed anyone's permission to value myself. That was the real victory. If there's one lesson I learned from everything that happened, it's this. People often confuse recognition with value. Those are not the same thing. For a long time, I believed that if I worked hard enough, eventually my family would see me differently. I thought that if I stayed responsible, stayed patient, and stayed loyal, the truth would become obvious. I was wrong. Not because hard work doesn't matter. It absolutely does. I was wrong because some people don't see what is in front of them. They see what fits the story they've already chosen to believe. My father believed Preston was the future of the family. So every success became proof. Every failure became an excuse. Every warning became jealousy. Everything was filtered through that assumption. My mother wasn't much different. She wanted peace more than truth. And when someone values peace above truth for long enough, they eventually start protecting problems instead of solving them. That's not cruelty. It's fear. And fear can make good people do disappointing things. One thing the military taught me is that the people doing the most important work are rarely the loudest people in the room. When a bridge survives a flood, nobody remembers the engineer who spent 14 months reviewing load calculations. When a supply route stays open during a disaster, nobody celebrates the planner who spent hundreds of hours preparing contingency plans. When infrastructure works, people usually don't think about it at all. That's actually the goal. The work becomes invisible because it succeeds. The same principle applies to families, businesses, friendships, and communities. The people holding everything together are often the people receiving the least attention. I know some of you understand exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you're the one who pays the bills on time. Maybe you're the one who checks on your aging parents. Maybe you're the one everyone calls when something goes wrong. Maybe you're the responsible sibling in a family that only notices the loud one. If that's you, I want you to hear something I wish someone had told me years ago. Your value does not decrease simply because someone fails to recognize it. A diamond doesn't become a pebble because a blind person walks past it. Your character remains your character, whether people applaud it or ignore it. That lesson took me a long time to learn. Too long. There were years when I secretly hoped my family would suddenly realize who I was. I wanted the conversation. I wanted the acknowledgement. I wanted someone to say, "We were wrong about you." There's nothing unusual about that. We're human. Most of us want to be seen. Most of us want the people we love to understand us. But eventually, I learned something uncomfortable. If your self-worth depends entirely on someone else's approval, then your peace belongs to them, not to you. Think about that for a moment. If another person's opinion controls how you feel about yourself, they effectively own part of your life. That's a dangerous arrangement. The healthiest thing I ever did wasn't buying the land. It wasn't signing the lease. It wasn't standing in front of my family at the gala. The healthiest thing I ever did was stop measuring myself through their expectations. Once I did that, everything changed. Not overnight, not magically, but steadily. I stopped trying to convince people who didn't want to be convinced. I stopped chasing validation. I stopped treating recognition like a reward I needed to earn. Instead, I focused on doing the work, the right work, the necessary work, the work that allowed me to sleep peacefully at night. And here's something I've learned from years of military service. You can survive criticism. You can survive rejection. You can survive being misunderstood. What becomes dangerous is abandoning your principles just to gain acceptance. That price is too high, every time. The land survived because someone chose responsibility over recognition. That's the part of the story that matters most. Not the deed, not the confrontation, not the reveal. Responsibility, quiet responsibility. The kind nobody celebrates until everything else falls apart. So, if you're listening to this and feeling overlooked, underestimated, or invisible, remember this. The people who create lasting value are often ignored in the moment, but integrity compounds over time, just like debt. Eventually, both become impossible to hide. And when that day comes, you won't need to announce who you are. Your choices will already have done it for you. A few weeks after the gala, I found myself thinking less about the deed and more about the people. Not just my family, people in general. The longer I sat with everything that happened, the more I realized this story wasn't really about land. The land was just the stage. The real story was about something far more common. It's about what happens when responsibility and recognition stop traveling together. Most adults eventually encounter this problem, maybe not on a 500-acre property, but somewhere, at work, at home, in relationships, in families. One person quietly carries the weight. Another person receives the attention. And over time, people begin confusing visibility with value. I've seen it happen everywhere. One of the most hardworking soldiers I ever served with spent 6 months coordinating supply movements across multiple states after a major storm damaged transportation routes. Every shipment arrived, every deadline was met, every problem was solved. When the operation ended, almost nobody knew his name. Meanwhile, another officer gave a presentation about the project and received most of the public recognition. Life can be funny that way. The same thing happens inside families. In fact, some of you probably recognized it immediately while listening to my story. There's often one child who becomes the center of attention. The family invests hopes, excuses, energy, and endless second chances into that person. Then there's another child who becomes the problem solver, the dependable one, the responsible one, the one everyone assumes will be fine. The strange part is that the responsible child often receives less support precisely because they're responsible. People stop checking on them. People stop asking how they're doing. People stop noticing what they're carrying. They become reliable, and reliability becomes invisible. That pattern is more common than most people realize. I receive messages from people who describe almost identical experiences. The details change. The dynamics don't. One sibling gets endless forgiveness. Another sibling gets endless expectations. One person's mistakes become learning experiences. Another person's mistakes become permanent labels. If you've lived through something similar, I want to share a lesson that took me years to understand. Being dependable does not mean you should become everyone's emotional storage unit. Too many people confuse sacrifice with virtue. Those are not always the same thing. Helping someone through a difficult period is healthy. Supporting family members during hard times is healthy. Standing beside people you love is healthy. But constantly rescuing people from the consequences of their own choices can become something very different. It can become enablement. That's where many families get trapped. My mother didn't protect Preston because she hated me. That's important to understand. She protected him because she convinced herself that protecting him was the same thing as protecting the family. Many people make that mistake. They confuse preserving comfort with preserving relationships. The problem is that comfort often comes at the expense of honesty. And eventually, somebody pays the bill. Sometimes that bill arrives years later. In my family's case, it arrived at a military gala. In other families, it arrives through financial crises. Divorces, addictions, broken trust, the form changes, the principle stays the same. Reality always sends an invoice. Another lesson I learned involves boundaries. A lot of people hear the word boundary and immediately assume it means cutting people off. It doesn't. A boundary isn't punishment. A boundary is clarity. It's deciding what behavior you will accept and what behavior you won't. For years, I thought being a good daughter meant tolerating things that hurt me. I thought patience required silence. I thought loyalty required self-sacrifice. I was wrong. Healthy loyalty does not require self-destruction. You can love people and still disagree with them. You can care about people and still say no. You can forgive people and still refuse to participate in unhealthy patterns. Those ideas sound simple. They're much harder to practice, especially when family is involved. Family has a unique ability to make grown adults feel 12 years old again. One conversation can reopen wounds you thought healed years ago. One criticism can pull you backward. One accusation can make you question yourself. That's why boundaries matter. They protect your ability to remain yourself. Not the version other people prefer. The real version. The version built on your values, not their expectations. If I could go back and speak to the younger version of myself, I wouldn't tell her to work harder. I already worked hard. I wouldn't tell her to be more patient. I already had patience. I would tell her something else. I would tell her that being needed is not the same thing as being respected. Many people spend years earning one while believing they're earning the other. They're not. Respect requires honesty. Respect requires accountability. Respect requires mutual responsibility. Without those things, you're not building a healthy relationship. You're maintaining an arrangement, and arrangements eventually expire. The lesson I hope people take from my story isn't that they should buy land or confront their families. That's not the point. The point is much simpler. Loyalty is a beautiful thing, but loyalty should never require you to abandon your self-respect. The moment it does, something needs to change. Because healthy relationships grow stronger when truth enters the room. Only unhealthy ones fall apart. And that difference can tell you everything you need to know. The older I get, the less interested I become in proving people wrong. That might sound strange after everything you've just heard. But it's true. When I was younger, I spent a lot of energy trying to earn understanding from people who had already decided who I was. I thought if I worked harder, explained myself better, stayed patient longer, or achieved enough success, eventually something would change. Eventually they would see me. Eventually they would understand. Eventually they would admit they were wrong. What nobody told me back then is that understanding is not something you can force another person to have. They either choose it or they don't. And that realization changed my life. If I could sit across from the younger version of myself today, there are several things I would tell her. Not because she was weak, not because she was failing, but because she was carrying burdens that never belonged to her. The first thing I would tell her is this. Stop trying to win arguments with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Notice I didn't say people who disagree with you. Disagreement is healthy. Reasonable people can disagree. What I'm talking about is something different. Some people don't listen in order to understand. They listen in order to defend a conclusion they've already chosen. Those conversations have no finish line. You can bring evidence. You can bring logic. You can bring patience. It won't matter. You're trying to solve a problem they aren't interested in solving. For years, I wasted energy on those conversations. I thought clarity would fix everything. It didn't, because the issue was never information. The issue was willingness. The second thing I would tell her is this. Do not confuse love with an obligation to tolerate disrespect. That lesson took me longer to learn than I care to admit. Many good people grow up believing that family relationships should be preserved at any cost. The problem with that idea is that it often places all responsibility on the healthiest person in the room. The responsible child must be patient. The responsible child must forgive. The responsible child must sacrifice. The responsible child must understand. Meanwhile, everyone else gets permission to continue behaving the same way. That's not love. That's imbalance. Real love includes accountability. Real love includes honesty. Real love includes mutual respect. Without those things, people aren't building relationships. They're building dependencies. And dependencies eventually become prisons. The third thing I would tell her is something every viewer should hear. Do not hand your self-respect to another person and ask them to take care of it. They won't. Not because they're evil. Because it's not their job. Your self-respect belongs to you, not your parents, not your spouse, not your boss, not your friends, not your children. You are the caretaker of your own dignity. The moment you understand that, life becomes much simpler. Not easier, simpler. There is a difference. Another lesson I learned involves competence. People often ask me how I stayed calm throughout everything that happened with my family. The answer isn't complicated. I trusted my work. That's it. When you've spent years building real skills, real knowledge, and real discipline, you stop depending so heavily on other people's opinions. Opinions change, competence remains. That's why I always encourage people to invest in themselves. Learn something useful. Master a skill. Develop expertise. Build character. Those things stay with you long after praise disappears. And praise always disappears eventually. One of the biggest surprises of my life was discovering that the most meaningful success had nothing to do with owning the land. It wasn't the deed. It wasn't the lease. It wasn't standing in that gala while the truth finally came out. The most meaningful success was learning how to live peacefully without needing approval from people who refuse to give it. That freedom is difficult to describe. When you stop chasing validation, you recover an enormous amount of energy. Energy you can invest elsewhere. Your family, your health, your purpose, your future. The things that actually matter. Looking back now, I realize the central lesson of this entire story can be summarized in a few simple ideas. Legacy is not something you claim. Legacy is something you protect. Responsibility matters more than recognition. Character matters more than appearances, and respect cannot be demanded. It can only be earned and maintained. Most importantly, dignity is not a gift. Nobody hands it to you. Not family, not society, not success. Dignity is built through choices. Small choices. Repeated choices. The choice to remain honest when lying would be easier. The choice to stay responsible when nobody is watching. The choice to protect something valuable even when you receive no credit for it. Those choices eventually become character. And character eventually becomes your reputation, whether people recognize it immediately or not. So if you've stayed with me through this entire story, I want to thank you. Not just for listening, for thinking. Because stories like this aren't really about one family. They're about choices all of us face in one form or another. If this story gives you something valuable, if it helped you see your own situation differently, or if it reminded you that your worth does not depend on someone else's approval, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. We share new stories every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Make us part of your daily routine. Until the next story, take care of yourself, protect what truly matters, and never let anyone convince you that your value depends on their ability to recognize it.